Forget everything you think you know about the Amazon. This is not a fairy tale tropical forest. It is a battlefield. We go beyond myths of ancestral spirits and legendary creatures to uncover the real monsters lurking in its depths, those that are destroying this vital ecosystem and threatening human lives at this very moment. Prepare to see the Brazilian Amazon as never before. To begin with, forget the image that was sold to us: vast green canopies, calm rivers, and a nature that governs itself. Today, the Brazilian Amazon is a complex landscape where political decisions, economic interests, and everyday violence intersect, generating a form of devastation that does not resemble mythological monsters. It looks like politics, economics, and omission. Since 2023, a new chapter has opened in the country's environmental agenda. Public promises, decrees, plans, and the reactivation of instruments such as funds and international partnerships. Yet while some indicators have improved, others show that the forest continues to suffer on multiple fronts: direct loss of area, hidden degradation, fires and contamination, and that translating policy into action on the ground still faces concrete limits. Official data from the PRODES system recorded 5,796 square kilometers of forest cleared between August 2024 and July 2025, a percentage reduction compared to the previous period, but still a loss representing thousands of irrecoverable hectares. These numbers reveal an ambivalence that will be the guiding thread of this documentary. Yes, there was a relative decrease in certain periods. Yes, international funds were resumed and targeted operations carried out. But the underlying dynamic, the combination of illegal exploitation, weak enforcement, economic pressures, and climate effects, produces an invisible horror that manifests in ways isolated statistics fail to capture. Independent studies and monitoring indicate that while clear-cut deforestation may fluctuate, forest degradation, processes that weaken forest cover without removing all trees, has grown sharply in some intervals, at a pace that worries experts because it reduces resilience and increases fire risk. Technical reports indicate a significant rise in degradation during certain periods, even when recorded deforestation declines. To understand why this tension exists, we need to look at three overlapping and mutually reinforcing layers: legislation and public policy, what is approved and announced, implementation and state capacity, what reaches the ground, and economic and criminal drivers, the actors who finance and carry out the devastation. In 2023, the federal government announced protective measures and a reorientation of the environmental agenda, including biome protection plans and the reactivation of governance and financing instruments. These measures were welcomed in international forums and helped reopen dialogue with partners who had reduced support in previous years. In turn, financing initiatives, including contributions and pledges to the Amazon Fund, returned to the center of negotiations. Still, the existence of laws and funds alone does not guarantee territorial protection. Turning commitments into continuous presence in the field is another matter. The core practical problem is simple to describe but difficult to solve. Governance requires physical presence, logistics, intelligence, and continuity. Where enforcement is delayed, production chains adapt. Where enforcement is episodic, illegal actors return as soon as pressure eases. In 2024 and 2025, we saw operations that demonstrated local impact. Integrated actions led to seizures and reductions in illegal activity in specific hotspots. But we also saw indications that without sustained operations and structural changes in trade chains, effects tend to be temporary. In short, the solution requires persistence, not just one-off actions. Consider a specific and highly damaging driver: illegal mining. Observers and environmental reports have documented clandestine mining, advancing along riverbanks and indigenous territories, using mercury to extract gold and contaminating aquatic ecosystems. Mercury is a persistent pollutant. It accumulates in the food chain, affects fish, and thus the people who depend on them, and causes serious, long-lasting health effects, especially in children and pregnant women. Mining also brings networks that require logistics, routes, and protection, and often overlaps with other illicit activities, establishing local economies dependent on illegality. Where the state is weak, this sector finds room to entrench itself. Data and satellite imagery confirm extensive areas affected by mining across multiple regions, and community reports confirm health and economic impacts. Another driver is the agribusiness and commodities chain. Beef, soy, and timber move through long chains of intermediaries before reaching ports and global markets. At each link, there is a risk of laundering, illegal lots mixed with legal ones, documents that fail to reflect true origin. In recent years, sectoral mechanisms such as moratoria and private commitments helped reduce pressure at certain moments. However, institutional moves that weaken these mechanisms or the withdrawal of major players from voluntary agreements undermine economic incentives for responsible practices. The suspension of sectoral agreements or the weakening of market norms can lower the economic cost of destruction, making the opening of new areas more profitable. Recent press reports pointed to decisions and institutional shifts that raised concerns by increasing risks of native vegetation conversion. At the same time, extreme climate events act as an impact multiplier. More intense droughts increase the vulnerability of degraded areas to fire. Burns used as agricultural techniques escape control and turn into large-scale wildfires that destroy primary forests. Data on fire detection in burned areas in recent years show peaks coinciding with dry years and land clearing practices, and federal authorities launched emergency operations to combat hotspots, including deploying brigades and extinguishing fires. These operations carry enormous costs and do not replace preventive measures that reduce pressure to burn. Alongside domestic dynamics, the international community has acted. Since 2023, significant efforts have been made to resume financing for the Amazonian environment. In 2024, donations and commitments were announced by countries such as the Nordics, as well as bilateral and multilateral commitments to strengthen the Amazon Fund and related initiatives. For example, Norway announced a $60 million contribution to the fund in response to observed reductions in deforestation, and larger commitments were signaled by other actors. In previous years, major donations and pledges, including from North American and European governments and institutions, had already been announced, channeling capital to monitoring, prevention, and sustainable development projects. These contributions, however, only translate into protection when there is transparency, continuity, and evaluation mechanisms, ensuring that resources reach actions on the ground. Back in Brazil, the evolution of policies themselves deserves close attention. In 2023, plans and decrees were announced to reorient environmental policy, strengthening the role of federal agencies, new monitoring systems, and the intention to reconnect the country with multilateral commitments. The government also presented macroeconomic transition plans and programs promising to combine protection with sustainable development. Organizations monitoring climate and environmental policies note progress on the agenda, but also emphasize that expected gains depend on robust implementation, especially in enforcement, law enforcement infrastructure, and alignment of public policies with local economic incentives. In other words, the policy exists. The challenge is operationalizing it with sufficient force to confront interests that benefit from degradation. It is essential here to explain what implementation means in practical terms. Implementation is not merely having a program on paper. It is deploying teams to hundreds of airstrips, rivers, and trails, equipping inspectors with logistics, aircraft, and technology, processing violations in administrative and judicial arenas, protecting whistleblowers and local leaders, and sustaining these actions for years, not months. In many areas, state infrastructure is limited, creating a political economic reality. The cost of enforcement is high, and the political reward for investing in it may be low or contested. This opens space for illegal actors to fill the vacuum. Expert and agency reports point to operational deficits at different levels and to the importance of integrated programs combining monitoring technology with physical presence. The human consequences of this equation are profound. Where traditional territories are invaded by miners, loggers, or land grabbers, communities suffer displacement, loss of access to rivers and fertile soils, and deteriorating sanitary conditions. There are direct health impacts: mercury contamination, respiratory problems due to smoke, and food insecurity resulting from the loss of fish and forest products. Reports by human rights organizations and independent institutions document cases of intimidation and violence against leaders who resist the invasion of their territories. These accounts reveal that the tragedy is environmental and social at once. The territory that sustains identities, local economies, and traditional knowledge is eroded. Given this scenario, we must ask, what works? Which interventions effectively reduce loss and restore protection? The combined evidence points to a set of complementary sustained measures: real-time satellite monitoring integrated with early warning systems, rapid response teams with adequate logistics, results-based financing with control mechanisms, accountability across supply chains that market products originating in illegal areas, and public policies offering viable economic alternatives for local communities, reducing dependence on predatory activities. Well-designed projects for community forest management, value chains for native products, and payments for environmental services show potential for scale when financing and governance are present. But all of this requires continuity. Episodic operations and one-off funding are insufficient. One point that cannot be ignored is the role of the global market. Pressure from international buyers and investors can drive structural change. Banks and funds conditioning credit on responsible practices, major buyers demanding traceability, and compliance mechanisms cutting market access for products linked to deforestation. However, market voluntarism has limits. When major purchasing chains withdraw from commitments, or when public rules shift to favor frontier expansion, the mitigating effect diminishes. That is why robust public policies, laws that enforce standards and impose real costs for destruction, are complementary and necessary to market actions. From a narrative and journalistic standpoint, this means the horror we seek to reveal is not a single spectacular act. It is a process. It appears in satellite images of carved clearings, in turbid rivers, in communities watching their way of life weaken, in police operations that only temporarily change the picture, and in risk maps indicating areas vulnerable to repeating the cycle. A camera crossing a contaminated river, the testimony of a community leader who has lost access to fishing, graphs showing trends. All of this is evidence of a systemic problem, not an isolated episode. Bearing witness to the process is a prerequisite for identifying the levers of change. There are, of course, reports of concrete advances that deserve recognition. Coordinated enforcement operations resulted in fines, seizures, and reduced illicit activity in delimited areas. Increased monitoring and the reactivation of international funds injected resources into prevention projects. And some sustainable development programs, when integrated with local communities, showed promising results. Recent examples demonstrate that when there is coordination among the Ministry of the Environment, enforcement agencies, development banks, and international donors, it is possible to assemble action packages that reduce pressure on critical areas. However, the story of these advances is fragile. It requires continuous political and financial maintenance to avoid regression. Having made these observations, what remains for the viewer and for policymakers is a practical conclusion. Recognizing the ambivalent reality of the Brazilian Amazon implies choosing between two paths. The first is short, reactive responses, episodic operations, communication campaigns, and one-off funding. The second is institutional persistence, strengthening capacities, integrating public and private actors, ensuring transparency in resource use, and changing economic incentives so that destruction becomes less profitable. The second path is harder, more expensive, and politically complex, but it is also the only one that offers a chance to sustainably reduce the invisible horror shown here. At the boundary between diagnosis and action, there are concrete short and medium-term measures that can be prioritized: expanding monitoring and rapid response, protection and security programs for environmental defenders and leaders, conditioning financial support on rigorous transparency and results criteria, and real economic incentives for product chains that respect origin and conservation. In addition, it is essential to create channels that make reporting and investigation more effective, protecting whistleblowers and ensuring that administrative processes lead to real accountability. These measures, combined with macroeconomic policies that make local agents less dependent on vegetation conversion, create a plausible pathway to reduce the scale of the problem. As we close this narrative, I repeat the opening point so it takes on practical meaning. The horror we reveal is not supernatural. It is not about spirits or legendary monsters. It is about human decisions, economic structures, and political omissions that produce real destruction. Recognizing this is a moral and strategic requirement. Those who see can act, and those who act with information and persistence have real possibilities to reduce harm. If there is anything this account seeks to provoke, it is precisely this: not panic, nor the satisfaction of celebrating isolated numbers, but the willingness to understand complexity and the need for continuous pressure for policies that truly work on the forest floor. Finally, for the Amazon to cease being the stage of an invisible horror, collective will, local, national, and international, will be required, along with the construction of institutional arrangements that withstand ruptures and interests that benefit from destruction. The right investments, continuous monitoring, effective accountability, and economic alternatives for those who live in the forest are pieces of a puzzle that, if assembled with seriousness, can transform a scenario of loss into a project of protection and recovery. Look at the images, listen to the testimonies, and ask yourself, what role can I play as a citizen, as a consumer, as a voter, to change this script's direction? The answer, if it exists, depends less on symbolic gestures and more on informed, persistent pressure on the decisions that shape the forest's future.